Hi everyone, this is Ellen from Astrology Journal. I want to take a look at Jupiter's ingress into Cancer. That's happening on June 9th at 5:02 Eastern Daylight Time. The themes that come to mind for me are, what are we giving birth to? I also think about things like karmic points and consciousness. Jupiter, as the traditional ruler of Pisces, has something to do with consciousness. Cancer also has something to do with consciousness in the sense that it has to do with ancestry and lineage. So you could sort of think of it as like an ancestral consciousness. And also, as opposed, Cancer opposed to Capricorn, Capricorn has to do with this idea of conditioning. And so that, in a certain sense, can speak to this idea of unconsciousness. Sometimes we see the shadow side. So if we're looking at one sign, we can get insight into it by sometimes considering the shadow side of its opposite side. So the opposite, the shadow side of Capricorn, would be this idea of unconscious conditioning, sort of tapes just running, and we're really aware of what we're doing. And to some extent, I think that's our journey as humans, because we are born into lineages and ancestral lines and cultures and all of that. And I believe the positive function and purpose of those is to give us a foundation, a grounding, so that we're not spinning around trying to survive and get our needs met. Those are tended to, and we're given sort of structure to organize our lives. And to the extent that those structures are in alignment, and those practices, we could say, are in alignment with what supports life, then that's wonderful. We get the ground we need, but we also need to make sure that those structures are supporting the unique individual that's been born to develop as who they are. And I believe that humans are by design inclined to grow in such a way that they want to learn and then share what they learn with others. They want to contribute to the collective. We're herd animals. It is our design to want to participate in and contribute to the collective. And to the extent that doesn't happen, I think my personal belief, and I can be really idealistic, but my personal belief is that points back to the collective, to the culture. So, and says, wait a minute, we didn't help this person figure out who they are. So that's very strongly my personal belief. Jupiter has to do with this idea of truth and lies and our beliefs. So that seems to be one that's developing very strongly in me. That's really giving me some grounding. And as I interpret everything, I kind of keep coming back to that. So anyway, this idea of Cancer and this idea of birth. So when a new child is birthed, that new child, by definition, is an emissary of the future. And so they need the stable grounding of the tradition and the culture, and the practices of this is how we nurture, this is how we care for you, etc., so that they are, you can say, a being of light, having an incarnated form. That's every human being, a being of light in incarnated form. And they need that sort of a kind of a soft landing so that they can ground that light. If it's a hard landing in the sense of, they're not getting their needs met and that sort of thing, then I think that perhaps inculcates from the very beginning a certain level of confusion and a kind of a need to be grasping and constantly clamoring for their needs to be met. And Jupiter, as traditional ruler of Pisces, represents not only consciousness but also this idea of confusion. So Cancer becomes a really important archetype in the idea of how are we raising our children? Are we giving them a stable foundation? We would normally think of foundation as Capricorn, but we can think about that as operating within the construct of Cancer. But even more explicitly in this chart, we have Saturn and Jupiter in their waxing first quarter square. About a week after Jupiter enters Cancer, it will actually perfect the square to Saturn. And this is the opening or waxing or first quarter square of this 20-year cycle between them. They conjuncted in December 2020 here at like 0 degrees of 29 minutes of Aquarius, the future. And now they've moved forward to such a point that they're now in their first quarter square with one another. So this is, I think, the first quarter square is really a significant point in the journey between two planets, I believe. It's almost like a point of initiation or a point of potentiation, where what has been laid down, the tracks that have been laid down up to this point, sort of come to a point where it's like, okay, now it's time. So if you think about the birth, a whole lot of things happen before that moment of, okay, now it's time to be birthed. But that moment of being birthed is a quickening. Maybe quickening is a better word. It's this quickening in the cycle. So the seed is planted at the new phase, and then there's this quickening in the cycle at the first quarter phase, perhaps. That's the way that I'm thinking about it. So the first quarter phase of the cycle. So the quickening, what do we land in? Is it a soft landing or is it a hard landing? And what goes into creating a soft landing and what goes into creating a hard landing? And I think this is actually a really important question for humanity to ask at this time, because do we really understand what the baby, the newborn really needs? And I ask that question having read the book, The Continuum Concept by Jean Liedloff, Liedloff. And I highly recommend people read that to really understand that we, even the best parents, we may be in a culture that has conditioned us to raise our children in ways that aren't really in alignment with what they really need. And that's no shade on any parent. That's not what I'm trying to say here. I'm not a parent, so it's easy for me to look at this and say, wait a minute. It's harder, I think, if you're a parent. But I think Liedloff herself makes the point, the idea isn't to go back and try to make that be our, what she's writing about, be her culture, be our culture, but it's to learn from that and take what we can and start to kind of help ourselves back to what the creating practices and structures that really allow all of us to be better caretakers of the child, the newborn of the child. So essentially, just to give a synopsis, she was just a regular person. She landed down in the Amazon. That was what happened in her life. And she met up with a tribe, and over the course of, I think, a 5-year period, she returned and spent a lot of time with them. And she just observed what she was seeing, and she was really struck with how they were raising their children and how different it was from how we raise our children. And she wrote a book about it. So that's what it's about. It's I thought, a really insightful, enlightening book. And so that's where I'm coming from when I talk about this idea of, are we really raising our children in alignment with what they really need, what they really need to grow into strong, contributing human beings in the world. Not forced to contribute because there's this idea that humans are bad and they're not necessarily going to contribute, so we have to kind of manipulate them into doing this thing. I think that's out of whack. I don't think that's what's true about human beings. We are herd animals, and we are also spiritual beings. And I think it is just the nature of spirit and also the nature of herd animals to participate and contribute. And so to the extent that's not happening, we can ask, why isn't that happening? And I think we have to look back at what are our practices? What are the structures? Practices, by the way, is Mercury. Mercury is in a new phase conjunction with Jupiter. Mercury in the sense of its rulership of Virgo. So what are our practices? I think that's always a question we have to ask. And then this idea of Saturn and Capricorn, this idea of conditioning. So one of the things that I think about is how conscious are our yeses. So if we think about a birth at the actual birth of the baby as a archetype for a birth process that happens over and over at different points in our lives, these quickenings that happen at different points in our lives, how conscious are we of when we meet that moment, how conscious are we? Or are we just playing the tapes, running the tapes that others have laid down in us that may not be in alignment with who we are? So this is why I think this is a really important thing to think about. So it's this idea of consciousness versus unconsciousness. So how conscious are we of the choices we're making? How conscious are we of the yeses we're making? Are our yeses based on the tapes that are running, or are they based on we're really starting to learn and understand who we are, and we understand we want to go in this direction, and that's the choice we're making? Or are we making choices to go along, to get along, to because that's the only thing we know, because, et cetera, et cetera. If you think about birth and the idea of the entering into a new territory, and also the idea of the newborn always being an emissary, by definition, is an emissary of the future, this idea of the future, we don't know the future. By definition, the future is something we don't know. So we can't lay down in a conscious way foundations that are specific to a future, but we can lay down foundations that give the new beings security and safety and the permission and the support and the structure to develop into who they are. And then we can trust that they'll build the future, the structures that future humanity needs, so that we all collectively can continue to evolve. Those are kind of ways that I'm thinking about these things. The new phase conjunction, so Jupiter and Mercury in a new phase conjunction, that's planting the seed. So to me, that's an Aries archetype, the idea of planting the seed. And the seed is life. So Aries is also this idea of the life force in the northern hemisphere. This Aries season, so to speak, is initiated at the vernal equinox. So it's the beginning of spring. And spring is just the life force coming back online, and it progressively just becomes more and more potent and powerful. And so there's this planting of a seed, and the idea perhaps of our societal Jupiter practices, perhaps planting a seed for new practices that truly support the newborn and growing into who they are and establishing themselves within themselves, so they can be secure within themselves, so that they can then feel empowered and are confident and have the courage, Aries courage, new phase courage, the courage to take the steps that are in alignment with who they are. I keep thinking about this idea of a puzzle. So a puzzle is made up of many, many pieces, and each piece is a specific shape. And in order for the puzzle to work, each piece has to be that specific shape. So if there's a piece that's misshapen, then you're going to have a flaw in the puzzle, because it won't really be able to fit into its slot. And if you have a whole bunch of puzzle pieces, the whole puzzle piece is made up of slightly misshapen or significantly misshapen pieces, you're not going to have a clear picture when that puzzle is done. You're not really even going to be able to complete the puzzle. You're going to get an approximation of a puzzle with pieces not really fitting in, and well, this is the best I can do. So it's the idea of we are each unique puzzle pieces, and we are all essential to the larger puzzle of the human organism. And so can we support each individual in being and growing into and evolving who they are, so that they too can contribute who they are to the overall benefit and well-being of the collective. There's a lot, over the last few years, the theme of narcissism has been really talked about a lot. I think maybe it amped up when Pluto entered Aquarius, although I think people were talking about it before, but it maybe came into our collective consciousness, like in a really big way, when Pluto entered Aquarius. So Aquarius is this idea of humanity and our enlightened selves. It also can do with this idea of trauma. Opposite of Aquarius is Leo, and if one sign can perhaps express the shadow side of another. Perhaps Pluto and Leo, Pluto and Aquarius, going down at the beginning of the sign in particular into the bowels of humanity to bring up what needs to be brought up into the light. Perhaps narcissism might be one of those things that's being brought up into the light. And so I'm not an expert, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, I haven't studied the DSM, etc., etc. But it strikes me that narcissism is a symptom of a culture that is not in alignment with what supports life. And so narcissism becomes the compensation, Jupiter, compensation for a culture that's out of whack. So we can point all day to that, this narcissist, that narcissist, that narcissist, and we're certainly seeing a lot of it, playing out, on the world stage. I'm not denying that's happening, but I think it's happening, frankly. We really need to look at ourselves as a culture, as a society. Why is this happening? Why have we created such a thing that the narcissists are, that narcissists are being created and they're in charge, right? So something like that. Interestingly, Mars is in the final 10 degrees of Leo, and in getting ready to enter Virgo, which is this idea of practice, skill development, all that, and humility and service. And so, and Mars also is this idea of warring. So perhaps these big wars writ large on the world stage in terms of big personalities, but also literally, perhaps they are, sort of burning into our consciousness in such a way that we'll be like, wait a minute, this is just really off. And perhaps it's setting us up to enter into Virgo and to really kind of take action to change sort of some underlying practices. And that goes along with this idea of structures. Virgo is the second earth sign. Capricorn is the third earth sign. So the practices sort of are part of what go into the structures that are meant to keep us stable. But so the question is, are the practices good? Are they sound? That sort of thing. So, and then we're talking about Cancer here, Jupiter entering Cancer. So the idea of the practices in terms of how we nurture and nourish ourselves and our children, how are we doing there? Are we supporting the people who are caring for their children? Are we supporting them and being able to do that? So anyway, there's this interesting thing going on. There is this yod pattern in the chart pointing to Jupiter and Mercury. So it's sort of saying the yod is this idea of the finger of God. The yod is the 10th letter in the Hebrew alphabet. It is the flame of God. My understanding of the yod in the Hebrew alphabet, and I would just look it up yourself so you can understand the symbolism for yourself. But my takeaway is this idea of it's both spirit and human. It's the flame of spirit in human form. And 10 amplifies. In numerology, 10 is 1, but the 0 in sun systems amplifies the 1. So it's this idea of unity, but 1 is also the individual. So this idea of Jupiter and Cancer to me is this idea, this yod pattern pointing to Jupiter is sort of emphasizing this idea that it's not about the individual and it's not about the whole, it's about both. It's the individual is the whole and it's part of the whole. And the whole supports the individual and the individual supports the whole. It's the whole thing, if that makes sense. And then interestingly, Mercury at 1 degree Cancer, the Sabian symbol is a man suspended over a vast level space. That's James Burgess's wording. Dane Rudger includes a man like on a magic carpet. I can't remember his exact wording, but let's just say a man on a magic carpet suspended over a vast level space or something like that. And Linda Hill also uses a magic carpet. Dame Rudger talks about this idea of it's not about getting perspective, isn't about leaving yourself behind. It's about actually being truly grounded in yourself. And by being grounded and anchored in yourself, that allows you to kind of scale back or pull back or whatever, or rise above and get perspective. If we can't ground in ourselves, we can't get perspective. We're overwhelmed by all the perspectives because we're grasping at the perspectives. But if we're grounded in ourselves, we can rise up, we can take a look at it, we're not really disturbed by it, and we can make choices from that place. So do we have traditions and practices and cultures in place, ancestral traditions, practices, cultures in place that support us in anchoring in ourselves so that we can be grounded? And by the way, this idea, forget about what I just said, but just this idea, Uranus is going to be moving into Gemini. Things are moving fast. Well, I think things are going to be moving even faster. And we want to be grounded in ourselves as this is all ramping up. The more grounded and stable we can be in ourselves, not fixed, not stuck, whatever, but the more grounded we can be in ourselves, the better we're going to be able to navigate this time. Think about being shooting the rapids, I don't know, the Colorado River or whatever. You don't succeed by being freaked out and ungrounded. You succeed by learning the skills that allow you to navigate those rapids safely and perhaps enjoyably, if you enjoy doing that kind of thing. But if you don't have the skills, if you don't know who you are, if you don't even know why you're there, you're probably going to be overwhelmed and it's probably not going to go well. And hopefully you have a guide or a bunch of guides in that boat who can do it for you, right? So that's some ideas. I encourage you to read about the yod. I read about it. It's not coming through very strongly, very clearly for me in terms of this reading. But I think it is really important, that symbolism of the yod for this chart. So I would encourage you to read it. On the other ends of the yod, so here we have Jupiter and Mercury here, and then on one end is the moon, and on the other is Pluto. So in evolutionary astrology, Pluto is the soul. The moon is the incarnation of the soul in this lifetime. So, and then the south node represents the incarnation of the soul in previous lifetimes, and that's the foundation that set us up for this lifetime. Those past lives set us up for this life. And then the north node is the future incarnations of the soul. So the moon, this is the south node of the moon. So past lives of our past egoic lives, you could say. And this is the north node of the moon. So past, present, future. So that's the idea from evolutionary astrology. So we have this idea of our soul, our incarnations as soul, the evolution, Pluto evolution of our soul, the evolution of our soul through each individual lifetime. And the moon rules Cancer. We start out in our lives as babies being nurtured by the mother and by the community, by the culture, by our, based on the traditions that have been passed down to us. And to the extent that the traditions that were in alignment with life, as presumably there was a time when all of our traditions were more in alignment with life, that maybe that's not true, but presumably, let's just say that was true. At some point, the traditions got distorted. We lost touch with how to actually raise our children. So the idea with this yod is, we all know this is a really important time, a really pivotal time in human history, in our human history, in our history as a collective human organism, you could say. And Jupiter's ingress into Cancer is saying, if we want to move through this point, through this transition period to the other end, we need to get back into alignment with what supports each individual and grounding in themselves so that they can be confident, Jupiter confident and secure Cancer in themselves, so that they can navigate the rapids of these times without, being overtaken, overwhelmed by fear, confusion, all that kind of stuff. And the ego, as much as we bash it, is actually really important. The ego, from an evolutionary astrology perspective, I don't think I ever fully grasped how they said it, but this is how I will say it. It's like it's a lens. So if Neptune, Pisces, is the all that is, the moon, Cancer, is the lens that focuses in, that allows us to be focused and become a clear being, so that we're not just this diffuse being. So the ego serves a purpose of allowing us to have this unique experience in this unique lifetime and these unique bodies and these unique, it allows us to express uniquely, the all that is through a unique lens, a unique filter, that sort of thing. And I feel like I never fully understood exactly how they explained it, but that's my interpretation of it. So anyway, those are my thoughts. There is also a grand trine. Pluto is in a trine with Uranus. It's an out of sign trine, but it's a trine, and also with the South Node. So Pluto is trine the South Node, and then Uranus and the South Node are trine one another. And they intersect at Pluto. So this is just emphasizing to me this idea of an evolutionary point. And the grand trine is this idea of the patterns are just happening. They're just happening. They're just happening. They're just happening. So these are we could say perhaps soul level patterns. But there's an awakening to them. Uranus and Uranus rules Aquarius, and then Pluto in Aquarius. There's an awakening to them. I think that's part of what's happening here. And perhaps part of that awakening has to do with recognizing, wait a minute, we're not supporting life. The structures, the systems, all of that, we're not supporting life. How can we support life? How can we start to evolve our practices back to being, and I'm presuming there was a time when we were in alignment with where our practices were in alignment with life. How can we evolve our practices such that they are back in alignment with life? And I'm not saying go back to, prior times. I'm just saying we want, to the extent that modernity is out of alignment with what supports life, we need to bring it back into alignment with life. That doesn't necessarily mean giving up everything. It means we need to make changes. Okay, so I think that's it. I think that is what I have to say. I hope there was something helpful or useful for you. Take what works, leave the rest. Trust yourself, not me. If there was anything that I said that was helpful for you, I'm so glad, and that's wonderful. May it support you in your journey as you continue to grow and evolve and heal. Okay, take care. Bye.